Have you ever put your faith in someone at church, only to be met with disappointment? My name is Deborah Mitchell. I'm 49 years old, a mother, a Christian, and until recently, I believed I would be safe within the church. I grew up surrounded by praise, prayer, and words of love for others. I got involved in ministries, attended retreats, and counseled other women, always believing that there, in that sacred environment, I would be protected from life's most cruel pains. But nothing prepared me for what happened. Nothing. When betrayal comes from where you least expect it, from someone who calls you sister in Christ, who prays with you, who shares tears at the altar, the pain isn't just emotional, it's spiritual. It's as if something breaks inside, and there's not enough glue in the world to hold the pieces together. And if you've ever been through this, or know someone who has, you know what I'm talking about. What you're about to discover may surprise you, because this isn't just a story of adultery. It's not just about a marriage that fell apart. It's about silencing, judgment, and abandonment, all within the environment where I most sought refuge, the church. Stay with me until the end, because what I have to tell you isn't just a rant. It's a warning, an invitation to healing, and perhaps a mirror for many other women who are silent, suffering in the front pew or behind the pulpit. I never imagined that the woman who prayed with me, who called me beloved, who said, "I'm here if you need me," would be the same woman secretly exchanging messages with my husband. It wasn't just the marriage that was broken. It was the trust, the blind faith in people, the sense of belonging, and worse, when it all came to light, what I felt most wasn't anger. It was shame. But before I tell you how it all happened and how I discovered the truth, I need you to understand who I was and how much this story goes beyond me. Because maybe, in some way, it also speaks of you. I was raised in church. From a young age, the narrow aisles, the wooden pews, the Saturday afternoon rehearsals, it was all part of my world. It wasn't just a place I attended on Sundays. It was where I grew, learned, and was formed as a woman, as a daughter, as a Christian. I remember the spiritual retreats where I cried at the altar, feeling God speak to me, the women's gatherings where I learned about forgiveness, purpose, and identity. It was more than a religious practice. It was my truth, my foundation, my life. Over time, I took on more responsibilities. I became a worship leader at 23, something I took very seriously. I prayed before every rehearsal, fasted before special services, and sought songs that would touch people's hearts. Because I deeply believed that this wasn't a performance, it was a ministry. Soon after, I was invited to help with the women's ministry. It was a strong group, full of prayer warriors. We met to intercede for families, marriages, and healings. Many saw me as a role model. I was the woman who counseled other women, who listened to their stories with empathy, who pointed out paths based on the Word. How many times did I sit with couples in crisis, praying with them, believing in restoration? How many times did I wipe away others' tears, never knowing that one day mine would fall silently? I loved serving. That was the word that defined me, servant. And not for appearances, not for status. It was something that fulfilled me. Being. Behind the scenes, contributing to the growth of the kingdom, making a difference even when no one was looking. That was the mindset that guided my decisions. I didn't think I was special, just willing. And perhaps that's why the fall was so painful. Because the higher you are in the heart of the church, the deeper the impact when everything falls apart. Today I understand there was a hidden truth there, behind the smiles, the applause in worship, the canned phrases in the hallways. Not everyone who raises their hands in praise has clean hands in everyday life. But back then, I didn't see it. I believed so strongly in the purity of intentions that I ended up forgetting something basic. Not everyone who speaks in God's name speaks for Him. And it was in this setting, surrounded by brothers in Christ, that I met the woman who would completely change the course of my journey. Someone who, at first, seemed like an answer to prayer, but who, little by little, revealed herself to be one of the greatest disappointments of my life. I got married at 26, after months of intense prayer. I remember the early mornings when I would kneel on the cold bedroom floor, asking God for guidance, wanting to discern if this man was truly the one He had chosen for me. I wasn't in love with an illusion. I was in love with someone who, at the time, seemed to be walking in the same spiritual direction as me. He was a soft-spoken man, a constant presence in church, with a way of leading that inspired respect. When we got married, some said we were living proof that God honors those who wait on Him. And for a time, I believed that too, with all my heart. We became the couple many looked up to. It was common for someone to approach us after church asking for relationship advice. We organized dinners for couples, spoke together at events, and testified about how waiting on God is worth it. On the outside, everything seemed perfect. Inside, I tried to keep that ideal alive, even when the routine got tough, even when communication began to dwindle and his spirituality seemed to stagnate. Still, I persisted, because when you build something with faith, the last thing you want is to give up at the first crack. For a long time, I was that woman who believed that every crisis was just a phase, that everything could be resolved with more prayer, more fasting, more surrender. I gave myself completely. I prepared everything with care, from the breakfast table to the planning of our moments of spiritual intimacy. I tried to keep alive that bond that, in my mind, had been sealed by God, but little by little, I began to feel something slipping through my fingers. And the scariest thing was that none of it came from outside. It wasn't worldly pressure. It wasn't external temptation. It wasn't the influence of someone unfamiliar with the faith. It was within our own home. And later, I would discover that it was also within the church. Back then, my mindset was still very innocent, or perhaps shaped by an idea of marriage that left no room for truth when it began to reveal itself. I clung to verses, promises, memories. I wanted to believe it was just a bad phase, that it would pass, until she appeared. A woman seemingly full of anointing, sweet words, and spiritual counsel. She arrived in the midst of our routine as if she were nothing, bringing a freshness that seemed harmless. A missionary, recently transferred from another congregation, with a painful history, and a welcoming manner that quickly charmed everyone, including my husband. She arrived slowly, as if she already bore some scars, but still had a sparkle in her eyes, discreet, kind, with that verse-rich vocabulary that seems to touch deeply. She was introduced to the church as a recently transferred missionary, coming from a distant congregation where, according to her own account, she had faced great spiritual battles, the kind of testimony that moves those of faith, the kind of story that generates almost instant empathy, and with me, it was no different. We started talking at the end of a Sunday service. She praised me for my praise, saying she felt God's presence intensely during worship. Then she thanked me for a message I had given to the women's group the previous week. She spoke with an engaging sweetness, as if she had known me for years. And when she called me soul sister, I felt a strange warmth in my chest, as if a sincere, pure connection had been born there, the kind that only faith can explain. Soon, our relationship intensified. We prayed together, exchanged devotional messages, and fasted together for church and community causes. She always seemed available, always willing to listen, advise, and help. She shared difficult stories from her past, betrayals, losses, deserts, and said that with me, she finally felt truly welcomed. She called me her shelter, and that, I confess, moved me, because I've always been like that, open, willing to receive, to embrace. I've never been one to be suspicious right away, perhaps because I've always believed that within the church love would be stronger than falsehood. I even opened my heart to her in moments of vulnerability. I shared doubts about my marriage, small insecurities that everyone has, and that at the time seem harmless enough to share with someone I trust. She listened attentively, prayed long, told me I was a woman of strength and that the enemy was bothered by my light, always with sweet words, always with that apparent spirituality that soothed as if her presence were a kind of relief. The curious thing is that behind all this welcoming, I began to notice small gestures that at the time seemed insignificant, but later became fundamental pieces in reconstructing the behind-the-scenes story. Loose comments about my husband, compliments disguised as observations like, "He has a beautiful heart, doesn't he?" Or, "It's admirable how he stands up for himself." Light-hearted jokes, sometimes even spiritual ones like, God unites people who recognize each other in spirit. At the time, I smiled and thought it was normal. But today, looking back, I realized that that blind trust, that emotional surrender, was shaped with precision. It didn't take long for her to become a constant presence in our home. She claimed to feel lonely in her new place, saying our family was a safe haven. And I, unknowingly, lovingly nurtured the environment that would later become a haven for my own pain. My mindset, shaped by the belief that welcoming is an act of faith, prevented me from noticing the cracks that were beginning to appear between the lines. Short silences between us, quick exchanges of glances, laughter in moments that didn't include me. But when we love, we interpret everything from the best angle. And when we serve God, we tend to believe that all the good we offer returns in a just way. But that's not always the case. Sometimes, the hidden truth hides precisely behind the most pious speech. It was in this setting, between shared prayers and Sunday dinners, that the seeds of betrayal were planted. And the cruelest thing of all is that, when they began to germinate, I still believed I was cultivating a friendship. At first, it was just a mild discomfort, the kind we try to ignore out of politeness or faith. A look that lingered too long, an inside joke between the two of us that I didn't understand, a touch on the arm that lasted a second longer than necessary. Nothing blatant, nothing obvious, just subtle signals scattered like disconnected pieces that, on their own, seemed innocent. But the body feels before the mind, and no matter how hard I tried to rationalize, something inside me began to twist. I remember one time, during dinner at our house, when they both laughed at something mid-sentence. I stopped talking, disconcerted, and she covered it up by saying it was something like-minded people do. It was in this kind of detail that the signs began to appear. But in my mind, it was just an impression. After all, she was a missionary. She had powerful testimonies, tears in the services, impeccable posture. And he was my husband. Our marriage had its ups and downs, like any other, but I never imagined that the emotional fragility he sometimes displayed could become a breach for something so serious. Sometimes I'd see them talking in low tones, too close. She'd say it was just about some ministry work, and I believed her. Because believing was easier than facing a possible betrayal unfolding right there in my own home with someone I'd reached out to. The truth is, my mindset back then was still stuck on the idea that those who truly serve God don't cross certain lines. And that blinded me. It made me see spirituality where there was manipulation. It made me confuse friendship with strategy. Today, I understand that was a hidden truth. Not all sweetness is genuine. Not all zeal is pure. My faith, which had always been my strength, also became my trap. I tried to justify every discomfort with verses about love, grace, and forgiveness. I reminded myself that jealousy was a work of the flesh and that suspicion without proof was unfair. So I repressed it. I swallowed my intuition as if it were weakness. I demanded silence. I told myself I was overreacting. It was easier to believe I was overly sensitive than to accept that perhaps I was seeing the backstage of something that had already begun. I betrayed myself to avoid admitting I was being betrayed, but the truth insists on emerging. It doesn't scream immediately. It whispers at first, nudges slowly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And when we don't listen to the small signals, it finds another way to wake us up. That's what happened to me. Because even though I believed it was all just an exaggeration, I began to notice a change in the atmosphere, a different tension. He began to avoid direct eye contact when she was around. She, in turn, began to compliment me more often, as if trying to make up for something. It was strange, almost theatrical, and yet I smiled, offered coffee, opened my home and my heart, as if love could protect, as if the good I did shielded my home. The mind finds creative ways to deny what the heart already knows, and I was at the center of this conflict, between what I felt and what I forced myself to believe, between silent pain and the hope of being wrong, until the day a notification on his phone appeared in front of me, quick but revealing enough to trigger everything I'd buried until then. It all happened so quickly. A notification on his phone's lock screen from a number saved with only initials. Today was special. I still feel the touch of your prayer within me. That froze my body. Outwardly, I remained motionless. Inside, it was as if 1,000 puzzle pieces were falling into place at once, revealing an image I'd fought so hard not to see. The world stopped for a few seconds. My breath caught. I read it again, to be sure, and there, in that seemingly spiritual sentence, lurked the kind of intimacy no one shares with their spouse. It wasn't about subtle signs anymore. It was about something that had already crossed the line. In that instant, everything that had been sensation turned into certainty. And as brutal as the pain was, almost physical, there was also a strange kind of relief. The end of doubt, the end of the guilt I'd carried for thinking it was just paranoia. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't exaggerating. Something real and profound was happening, and I needed to face it. If you're listening to me this far, and this story is moving you in some way, if something inside you recognizes this mix of pain, intuition, and silence, I want to ask you one thing with all my affection. Like this video. It's not just a click, it's a gesture that helps this kind of story reach other women who may be experiencing exactly this and haven't yet been able to name their pain. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of true, courageous, and necessary content. When you like it, you help break the silence, and that in itself is already a form of transformation. But back to that scene. I stood there, motionless, with my phone still in front of me. He came out of the bathroom as if nothing had happened, and I, holding back a storm inside, just smiled and said I'd go to bed early. I needed time, not to understand what was happening. That was already clear, but to decide what to do with the truth that had finally revealed itself. I don't remember exactly how I ended up sitting on the bathroom floor that night, my back pressed against the cold wall, my eyes fixed on some random spot on the tile. His phone was still there, on the sink, unlocked. Part of me wanted to drop everything, close my eyes, and pretend none of it was real. But the other part, the one already hardened by silences, needed to see clearly. And I did. I read every line, every exchange, every amen that came disguised as desire. The first message already hurt. The second, even more so. And when her name appeared there, as the sender of a conversation that in no way resembled prayer, my stomach turned. It was her, the same one who said she was praying for us, the same one who fasted with me, the one who sent me verses early in the morning, telling me the Lord was strengthening us. I believed so deeply in that. Friendship. I trusted her to the point of sharing the behind the scenes of my pain, unfiltered, unreserved. I told her about my crises, my vulnerabilities, my sleepless nights, and it was precisely through these gaps that she entered, not as an enemy, but as someone extending a hand saying, I'm here for you. And deep down, she was, but not for me. Those messages were like sharp knives cutting through something I couldn't yet name. There was the weight of betrayal, yes, but there was something deeper, the feeling of having been used, deceived, invaded in the most intimate place, the one not everyone has access to. This wasn't just about my marriage. It was about my faith, about my naivete, about how, even after so many years of service, I still believed that all people who speak about God carry the same reverence for Him. I stood there for hours, unable to move. I felt shame, anger, sadness, and, strange as it may seem, a loneliness that echoed from within. It wasn't the kind of loneliness felt by someone without someone by their side. It was the kind of loneliness felt by someone who realizes they've been accompanied, but never truly seen. Because in that story, I was the one who prayed, the one who trusted, the one who believed. And they, the ones who plotted between the lines of what they called spirituality. It's strange how certain revelations can completely reconfigure our perception of reality, as if someone had removed a veil and everything that was once hazy was now painfully clear. Truth has this power to strip one naked, and there, stripped of illusions, I realized how much I had ignored my intuition, how many times my heart wanted to warn me, but I silenced it in the name of spiritual maturity. How many times I felt something didn't fit, but swallowed hard, telling myself that distrusting a sister in Christ would be a lack of love. The masks fell brutally, and as much as that seemed like the end, it was also the beginning of something I would only understand later. Because sometimes pain doesn't just come to break us. It comes to expose the fragile structure on which we're building our lives and invites us to rebuild with truer foundations, even if it costs us everything that seemed solid. And it was like that, amid the emotional rubble of that discovery, that something inside me began to move, not like someone reacting impulsively, but like someone awakening after a long silence. He entered the room as if nothing had happened. The same rehearsed calm, the same tone of voice, as if believing that denial can erase a truth already exposed. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, my phone still in my hands, my eyes fixed on him. I didn't speak right away. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked. A look that already carried the weight of discovery, the pain of disappointment, and a silent, echoing question. How far would you go to sustain this lie? When I finally opened my mouth, I showed him the messages. He hesitated for a second, and in that tiny space between the lie and the attempted defense, something inside me shattered completely. "This isn't what it seems," he said, as if that sentence could still cast a shadow of doubt on what lay before us both. He denied it. He said it was a misunderstanding, that it was all spiritual, that I was being used by the enemy to bring division. And there, amidst so much distortion, I realized how easy it is to manipulate when faith is used as an excuse. She, on the other hand, didn't try to deny it, not with words. She remained silent. She cried, a lot, but I never said I'm sorry. She never explained. She never even tried to support anything. She just cried, maybe out of embarrassment, maybe out of regret, or maybe just because she'd been caught. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions, to understand how it all started, why she did it to me, why to him, but something silenced me. There was no more digging in that wound. The truth was already there, exposed, painful, and raw. And then, days later, she disappeared. Without warning, without a goodbye, without any conversation to close the cycle. She stopped attending church, disappeared from groups, from social media. She became silent. And the curious thing is that even though I was the one betrayed, it was me who was weighed down by shame, as if it had all been my fault, as if I had allowed too much, trusted too much, kept too quiet. Shame has this effect. It distorts the role of victim and villain. It makes you question even your own sanity. Did I overreact? Was I too harsh? Should I have prayed more, fasted more, loved more? But no love justifies betrayal, and no prayer masks character. I needed to gradually understand that some people use God's name as a cover for their own interests, and that just because someone knows the Bible doesn't mean they're afraid. The hidden truth behind many spiritual situations is that there are hidden undertones of vanity, neediness, inflamed egos, and unresolved desires. And all of this mixes together in such a subtle way that we don't even notice when we fail to discern. The days that followed were strangely silent. He was still at home, but the air was heavy, tense, almost unbearable. I looked at him and saw a stranger, someone I'd called a companion for so long, but who now seemed like just another character I no longer recognized. I tried to talk, yes, several times. I tried to understand if there was any sincerity left, any possibility of rebuilding. But each attempt was met with coldness, with religious justifications, or with the weariness of someone who seemed to have emotionally left the place a long time ago. And little by little, I began to realize that the greatest abandonment wasn't physical, it was emotional abandonment. The lack of accountability for what had been done, the avoidance of the truth, and the total absence of true repentance. I continued attending church, but now with a lump in my throat and a weight on my chest. You know that feeling that everyone is looking at you, commenting, judging you, even when no one says anything? That's what I carried. And not because I had done anything wrong, but because, unfortunately, that's how many women feel after being betrayed. As if someone else's failure had tarnished our dignity as well. As if their shame had somehow spilled over into our identity. And that affects everything. Our self-image, our spirituality, the way we relate to others, and most importantly, to ourselves. That was the cruelest part. Not the mistake itself, but the silence afterward. The way he continued to live his life normally, while I was the one bleeding inside. And the most ironic thing is that, on the outside, everything seemed fine. No one saw what was going on behind the scenes. No one imagined what I was facing at home, nor the internal conflicts that consumed me silently. It was like living an invisible war. And on this battlefield, where everything seemed to be falling apart, I began to realize that reconstruction wouldn't come from the outside in. During that period, amidst the internal chaos that was already difficult to bear, I still had to deal with something that destabilized me in a way I hadn't expected: the church's silence. And not a neutral silence, but the kind of silence that screams, that hangs heavy in the air, that makes you feel as if suddenly you've done something wrong just because you've been hurt. It was as if my pain bothered me, as if speaking about what was happening threatened the fragile peace that many preferred to keep intact, even at the cost of the truth. Some brothers, people who prayed with me, who said, "Count on me," simply fell silent. They avoided eye contact. They changed the subject. They pretended not to know anything. And worse, there were those who said, "It's none of our business," as if the wound to one limb could be ignored without affecting everything else. But what hurt most were those who, even knowing about the betrayal, advised me to keep a low profile. "Forgive and don't expose, sister. It's not worth tarnishing anyone's name," as if his name were worth more than my dignity, as if silence were synonymous with holiness. I was advised to keep smiling, to keep serving, to keep silent, and in the process, I almost lost my voice. I felt silenced, erased, almost invisible in a place where, until then, I believed I would be supported. I had no shortage of generic prayers or memorized verses about forgiveness, but I lacked true acceptance. I lacked someone to look me in the eye and say, "You're not wrong for being hurt. You're not wrong for wanting justice." What I found, in many cases, was a mechanical spirituality, more concerned with appearances than with true restoration. It's curious how, within many religious contexts, the wounded woman is the one who must prove that she remains pious, that she is still sweet, that she won't cause scandal, that she is willing to move on in peace, even with her heart in pieces. I heard phrases that still echo like knives in my memory. "You need to have more wisdom to deal with this. Every marriage goes through struggles. Men are like that, but God changes. And the cruelest of all, you need to ask yourself what was missing in you that made him seek someone else." These words didn't come from cold people. They came from beloved voices, from experienced women, from respected leaders, and perhaps that's why it hurt so much, because it's these small distortions, these hidden truths no one wants to face, that sustain cycles of abuse disguised as long suffering. I wasn't just dealing with marital betrayal. I was confronting an entire system that subtly placed the weight of the error on the one it hurt. The emotional wound was deep, but the spiritual wound, it bled silently. And it was at that point that something began to shift within me. Amidst so much veiled judgment and so many ready-made phrases, I began to question, not my faith, because that, curiously, remained intact, perhaps even stronger. But I began to question the environment around me, the structure, the mentality, the decisions so many make in the name of a peace that in reality only serves to keep everything as it is. The church, which should be a place of healing, had become in that moment a mirror of patterns I needed to break, because behind the denial of facts and the advice disguised as care, there was something deeper: the fear of facing the truth, the fear of admitting that even in spiritual environments, there are human flaws that need to be confronted with courage, not stifled with religiosity. And that's when I understood that my journey of transformation would require much more than emotional overcoming. It would require repositioning, a new mindset, the decision to no longer accept the supporting role within my own story. I began to realize that being heard wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, that breaking the silence wasn't a lack of forgiveness, but a step toward healing, and that the impact of my story wasn't just what I'd experienced, but how I chose to navigate it all. I was still broken, yes, but I was also beginning to gather enough strength to see, more clearly, that that pain wouldn't be the end of me. It could, in fact, be the beginning of something I never would have dared to experience if I hadn't been forced to awaken. I don't know if there's a delicate way to describe what it's like to go through a sleepless night when your soul is shattered. Perhaps the word darkness comes close, but not in the literal sense. It's a darkness that doesn't extinguish the light in the room, but silences everything inside you. It's as if your body is there, but your spirit is wandering, trying to understand what just happened. And there were many nights like that. Nights when the pillow became your confidant, when the tears weren't just sadness, but a mixture of anger, disbelief, and a feeling of abandonment that's hard to name. I found myself repeating the same question, like an unanswered prayer. Why, God? Why did this happen in your house? It wasn't just about the betrayal. It wasn't just about the humiliation. It was about the context. It was about the place where it all happened, the place where I trusted, where I surrendered, where I served with everything I had. When the ground disappears inside what you believe to be your refuge, the impact is different. The fall is deeper. Because not only does the marriage crumble, but also your perception of faith, protection, and justice. And the loneliness that followed was like a second wave, an echo of the first pain, but with a different texture. Because what had once been a house full of people now felt like an emotional desert. Friends dwindled, invitations ceased. Even the messages that once came frequently began to thin out. It's hard to explain how the silence of others can scream so loudly within someone. And worst of all, at many moments, I began to believe that I was the one who was wrong for feeling all this, that maybe I should be stronger, more spiritual, more resilient. But the hidden truth no one tells you is that post-trauma is a lonely place. And no matter how many people are around, there are pains that only the soul feels, and it feels them in silence. There were nights when I prayed without a voice. I just let the tears speak for me. There were days when I dragged myself to church, trying to cling to some shred of faith, even though I couldn't understand if God was listening to me or just allowing the process. I wanted answers, but all I had was the question, what now? Inner transformation, though it may seem beautiful from the outside, often begins in the dark. It doesn't begin the moment you decide to turn the page. It begins when you realize you don't even have the strength to hold the book, when all you have left is to take a deep breath and try to live another day. And that's when something began to change, not externally, but within me, a kind of silent revelation, an almost imperceptible feeling that God was still there, not as someone who immediately stops the pain, but as someone who remains even when the whole world seems to have turned its back. This subtle, almost imperceptible presence was what sustained me. No angels came, no answers from heaven. But from time to time, a strange peace came, as if an invisible hand touched my chest and said, I know. That sometimes was all I needed to keep going. And it was in this secret place of pain and faith intertwined that a new version of me began to gestate. Still fragile, still confused, but with a different mindset. Because when you're broken, you have two choices. Either pick up the pieces and try to look the same, or accept the challenge of rebuilding yourself differently. And rebuilding yourself has nothing to do with quickly smiling again or showing the world that everything is okay. Sometimes it's simply getting out of bed, opening the curtains, eating something, talking to God even when you don't feel like it, choosing the right silence, the kind that heals, not the kind that makes you sick. It was in this process that I began to distinguish what came from God and what came from fear. Because fear makes us silent, makes us doubt, makes us hide. But God invites us to the light, even if the path to it is long, uncomfortable, and full of difficult revelations. I still felt alone, and in many moments I still do. But I stopped believing that this loneliness was a sign of abandonment. It began to feel more like a necessary time, a space between who I was and who I was about to become. It wasn't punishment, it was transition. And when I began to see it that way, everything began to make a little more sense. Not in the logic of pain, but in the logic of faith. Because there are processes that don't serve to destroy us, but to reposition us. And even if no one else sees, even if everything is silent, it is there, behind the scenes of the soul, that God performs the greatest transformations. Reconstruction didn't come like a sudden turn of events, nor like a sunny morning that suddenly dispels the fog from the soul. It came like stepping over broken pieces barefoot, slowly, painfully, uncertainly, but it did, and it wasn't by force nor by merit. It was grace, a kind of grace that doesn't lift us onto a stage, but sustains us at rock bottom. I knew I could no longer carry on as before, feigning strength where there was only exhaustion. And it was in this exhaustion that I decided to seek help, not because I wanted to appear strong, but because I recognized I could no longer go on alone. Christian therapy was a turning point, not because it solved everything, because it didn't, but because, for the first time in a long time, I felt I could say everything without being judged, without filters, without masks, without fear of appearing ungrateful to God or weak in the face of faith. And there, in that silent room, I was unraveling the knots that trauma had tied within me. As I spoke, cried, breathed, a new realization dawned. I wasn't the mistake. I wasn't the failure. I was someone who had weathered a storm I never chose, and yet I was there, trying to start over. That, in itself, was a miracle. I started writing again, and for me, it was like opening a crack in a long-closed window. Each word that appeared on the page was an attempt to reconnect with myself. And, curiously, it was through writing that I realized how fertile ground my pain had become. Not in the romantic sense, but in a real sense. There were unanswered questions, yes. There were open wounds. But there were also revelations, lessons learned, raw strength, the kind that emerges when everything falls apart and we discover we're standing even without understanding how. Prayer became a part of my daily life again, but not like before. Not as a memorized ritual, nor as an attempt to prove holiness. It was something more intimate, more raw, more true. Sometimes it was just a whisper. Other times, an intentional silence, as if waiting without demanding. I began to understand that God is not offended by our pain, that He does not turn away when we don't know what to say. In fact, it was there, in the middle of nowhere, that I felt God lifting me up, without spectacle, without a crowd. It was as if He were sitting, with me on the ground, holding my hand until I had the strength to stand. This rebuilding didn't have a triumphant soundtrack. There were setbacks. There were days of doubt. There were moments when I considered giving up on faith, on the process, on everything. But there were also small beginnings, a spontaneous smile in the middle of a difficult day, a verse that seemed written for me, a friend who called at just the right moment, unaware of how much that "I'm here" saved me. Life slowly returned, but with a different texture. Before, I wanted to fix everything. Now, I just wanted to learn to live in a lighter, more authentic, more personal way. And don't think it was simple, because it wasn't. Rebuilding requires internal decisions that no one sees. It requires courage to escape victimhood, but also compassion to embrace one's own failures. It's a journey where each step carries the weight of what was lost and the hope of what can still be built. And it was in this place of rebuilding that I began to perceive a subtle movement. God wasn't just restoring me, He was repositioning me. The pain that had silenced me now gave me a voice. The shame that hid me now transformed into a shared story. And the desert that seemed only punishment was revealing itself as the soil of a new purpose. My mindset began to shift, no longer trapped by expectations of what others wanted to see in me, but connected to what God saw, even when I couldn't see it myself. The hidden truth behind pain is what it reveals. It reveals what is fragile, yes, but it also reveals what is unshakable. And when we find this core, this center that cannot be shaken, even in ruins, a different kind of trust is born. Not in tomorrow, but in those who walk with us until then. I was relearning how to be whole, even without all the pieces. And that, paradoxical as it may seem, is freedom. The freedom of no longer needing to prove anything, of no longer carrying labels that no longer fit, of no longer fitting into molds that hurt. It's a new beginning, not because everything is resolved, but because now there's enough clarity to move forward, even with fear, even without guarantees. And as this new chapter began to unfold before me, a silent question began to echo within. What if all of this, somehow, is leading me to something greater than I ever imagined? The revelation didn't come as a whisper. It came like a punch in the gut, the kind that takes the breath away for a few seconds. I hadn't expected it. I no longer searched for answers. He had already accepted that some things would remain unexplained. But suddenly, there it was, the truth, raw, direct, and uncomfortable. Months after everything, someone took me aside with that hesitant air of someone who's carried a secret for too long. And that's how I knew. That woman, the same one who had invaded my story, destabilized my home, provoked a rupture that brought my life to its knees, had done it before, in another church, with another family, with the same kind of manipulation, the same spiritual disguise, the same performance of piety. I was paralyzed, not with fear nor with anger, but with astonishment. It was as if, for the first time, someone had lifted the veil covering that chapter of my story. And what I saw behind it wasn't my own personal error. It was a pattern, a cycle, a silent, dark repetition that had never been confronted. And there, in that moment, I realized how much I had blamed myself for nothing, how much I had corroded myself, questioned myself, punished myself, as if I had been too naive, too stupid, too passive. But no, it wasn't about me. It was about her, about a game she already knew how to play, and about a structure within the church that preferred silence to facing the truth. It was liberating, yes, but also deeply sad. Because with the revelation came a bitter feeling. How many others were silent like I was? How many were still blaming themselves, hiding, believing they were weak for not realizing it sooner? It's much easier to point out the fragility of those who fell than to see the silent behind-the-scenes actions that allowed it to happen. And this realization hurt me in a place I didn't even know existed. Catharsis didn't come from shouting or confrontation. It came from lucidity, from clarity. I wasn't the cause of the chaos. I had been the target, and in a way, this reconnected me with my own dignity. It was like recovering a piece of myself that had been ripped away by deception. Because when the truth comes out, it doesn't just change what happened. It changes how we see ourselves within what happened. And this has a profound impact on how we move forward. From that moment on, everything began to reorganize itself internally. Not like someone seeking revenge, but like someone finding solid ground again. I no longer needed to hide. I no longer needed to justify every tear, every distance, every silence. For the first time, I was able to look at myself with compassion, without that distorted filter of guilt. And I was also able to look at her with the clarity that only emotional distance allows. Not with hatred, but with the firmness of someone who recognizes the damage and chooses to no longer accept any kind of abuse disguised as spirituality. The curious thing is that this revelation taught me more about justice than any sermon, because true justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it reveals itself at the right time, in the right setting, as if to say, now you're ready to see. And I was, because if this truth had arrived sooner, perhaps I would have used it as ammunition, not as understanding. Perhaps I would have sought to expose, to shout, to hurt in return. But now, all I wanted was to breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that what destroyed me wasn't my weakness. It was the repeated and reckless actions of someone operating in the shadows of faith. Reconstruction, which had previously seemed like a lonely path, now took on a new dimension. It was also an act of internal justice, of repositioning my story in its proper place, of naming what happened without fantasizing. The pain was real, the impact was profound, but now I knew the narrative was no longer controlled by trauma nor by silence. It was mine, and that changed everything, because when you reclaim the power to tell your story, you also reclaim the right to decide how it ends. This shift profoundly changed my mindset, because it wasn't just about me. It was about seeing the system, the silent permissions, the invisible pacts that sustain certain toxic behaviors within places where care should be a priority. It was as if God, little by little, was illuminating the scenes, not to embitter me, but to position me. Because there are truths that liberate, but also empower, that reveal, but also heal. And there, faced with that revelation, I realized my pain would not be wasted. It was generating something new, deeper, stronger, more conscious. And perhaps the most transformative thing was understanding that my voice, which had previously trembled, now carried weight. that my story, which had seemed confusing, now held direction, that the same woman who once begged for explanations in the dark now walked with enough light to help others recognize the same patterns and break free from them. And this movement, silent and steady, began to take me to a whole new place. There came a time when remaining silent began to hurt me more than anything I had ever experienced. It was as if keeping the truth to myself was, little by little, erasing me from within. Not because I wanted revenge or approval, but because my conscience began to scream for integrity. And integrity, at that point in the journey, was no longer about image, it was about internal coherence, about living with a peaceful soul, knowing that you didn't let lies dictate the chapters of your story. I decided to speak out, to speak with my heart exposed, but firm, not just for myself, but for all the women who, like me, have been betrayed, silenced, and disbelieved, especially within the church. And it wasn't a romantic decision. It was riddled with fear, insecurities, and memories that still hurt like open wounds. But it was also driven by a conviction that grew stronger every day. Some stories need to be told so that others don't happen again. And I could no longer contribute to the complicit silence that so often protects abusers while isolating victims. The process of expressing this clearly and responsibly was a true emotional journey. Because it's not enough to have something to say, you have to find the right tone, the right motivation, the right moment. And I understood that speaking out wasn't synonymous with scandal. It was an act of reparation, a way to restore dignity to the parts of me that had been crushed by distorted narratives. It was about naming what hurt me, but without letting it define me. About exposing what needs to be exposed, not for the sake of exposure, but for liberation. I knew that by opening my mouth, I would also open the door to criticism, distortions, and judgments. But at that point, there was no turning back. When we experience lucidity after living in the shadows, silence becomes an unbearable weight. I needed to be honest with my story, with all its pain, yes, but also its overcoming, awareness, and transformation. And it was in that decision that I rediscovered a strength I didn't even know I had. Verbalizing all that was like unlocking a key within me. I realized it wasn't just a voice echoing in the void. With every word spoken, messages arrived. Women who had also lived similar stories, many of them silent for years. Some didn't even know they could name what they experienced. Spiritual abuse, emotional manipulation, betrayal. Others were in the eye of the storm, still trying to understand where they had lost their way. And there, in that silent exchange that only those who carry similar pain understand, a collective consciousness was born. A kind of shared courage that goes beyond empathy. It is a connection between scars. It was at that moment that I understood the true impact of my journey. It was no longer about defending myself, justifying myself, or repairing what had been destroyed. It was about rebuilding, not only myself, but also the space around me. A more lucid, more conscious, safer space for those still walking in the dark. Speaking out became an act of resistance, of breaking with the culture of silence that so often paralyzes, sickens, and imprisons. And the more I spoke, the more I realized there is a hidden truth that urgently needs to be brought to light, that many women of faith are being wounded within environments where love should be the principle. This truth confronted me with profound decisions. I had to rethink concepts that once seemed unquestionable. I had to face how, for so long, I had repeated discourses that I now knew were hurtful. I had to deconstruct, relearn, and mature. Because empowerment, in my case, didn't come with slogans or waving flags. It came with pain, with prayer, with a process. It came with the courage to look in the mirror and acknowledge, I'm not the same, and that's okay. There's no romance in going through an internal earthquake and still having to explain the rubble to others. But there's power in transforming the rubble into foundation. And that's what I chose. No more silence. No more softening to please. No more hiding to protect structures that benefit from others' silence. Because if there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's that truth heals. It hurts, yes. It confronts, but it also liberates, strengthens, and guides. Today, my voice is no longer a cry for help. It's a declaration of presence. It's my way of saying, I survived, and I won't waste this survival by pretending nothing happened. Because every time a woman decides to tell her truth, she paves the way for others to do the same. And this has an impact that goes far beyond the personal. It's collective, it's spiritual, it's revolutionary. I continue to be the one who prays, who believes, who loves the church, but I'm also the one who decided to no longer romanticize abuse in the name of faith, and who understands that honoring God does include fighting for justice, integrity, and truth, inside and outside the pulpit. The journey thus far has been marked by difficult revelations, but also by profound encounters with myself. And now, more than ever, I knew the next step would be even more challenging, and perhaps for that very reason, even more transformative. Because the path that opened before me wasn't paved with certainties. It was paved with awareness. And this awareness brought me a different kind of faith, rawer, more human, more aligned with who I truly am. For a long time, I was taught that faith meant not doubting, not questioning, not confronting. But now, with everything I've experienced, I realize that the strongest faith isn't the one that avoids questions, but the one that survives difficult answers. My faith today is more mature. It's not perfect, but it's real. Real in the deepest sense of the word, without makeup, without performance, without the obligation to appear unshakable all the time. I still believe in God, but with more open eyes, and perhaps that's precisely where beauty lies. In the freedom of not having to pretend to understand everything, of not having to support systems that harm in the name of supposed spirituality. I discovered that it's possible to maintain a sensitive heart and at the same time have a discerning mind that believes and also analyzes, that loves and also takes a stand. This new faith wasn't born of comfort, it was born of crisis. It was in the shadows of pain, of emotional collapse, and of nights when silence screamed louder than any prayer that it began to form. And ironically, the more everything around me crumbled, the more I discovered a divine presence that didn't require me to pretend to be okay. God didn't ask me for strength when I only had fragments. He found me right there, inside out. And contrary to what many expected, that I would lose my faith, it was in that chaos that it was reborn, cleaner and deeper. But this required a confrontation. I needed to undo the image of faith I'd been taught, that rigid faith which demands perfection and places more weight on rituals than on inner truth. I had to leave behind a religious structure that, although it had welcomed me in the past, no longer accommodated the woman I was becoming. It wasn't an aggressive rupture, but a necessary separation. Because when your consciousness awakens, you can no longer fit in where truth is stifled. I began to see nuances where before I had only seen black and white. I began to question preconceived notions, to distrust authorities who speak in God's name but act as ruthless judges. And curiously, the more I questioned, the closer I came to the essence of the gospel, because there, far from the performance, I began to understand that Jesus was never an ally of those who oppress. He always stood by the wounded, the rejected, those who dared to touch their own pain without shame. It was in this encounter with the simplicity of a living faith, which pulses even amidst the cracks, that my heart found rest. It wasn't easy getting here, because letting go of the certainties that sustained us for so long hurts. It's like letting go of an old house you've lived in for years. Even with leaks, it felt familiar. But at the same time, there's a liberating relief when you decide to build a new home from the inside out. A faith that no longer bows to the fear of rejection, but is guided by principles that generate life, awareness, and compassion. This turning point in my spirituality affected everything. The way I pray, the way I read the Bible, the way I relate to church, and even the way I see myself. Today, my connection with God no longer depends on applause or third-party validation. It happens in my room, on my walk, in silence, in confusion. It happens even when I'm at a loss for words. Because real faith isn't always eloquent. Sometimes it just breathes and endures. And the most beautiful thing is realizing that by abandoning the old format, I didn't lose my faith. I reconnected with it. Now it's not a weight I carry trying to please others. It's an inner flame, moving me freely, with purpose, with truth. I no longer need to pretend to be strong all the time to feel spiritual. Now I know that fragility can also be sacred, that God doesn't expect me to be perfect. He welcomes me whole, even in the most disconcerting parts. Many people still believe that speaking openly about their wounds, especially within a Christian environment, is synonymous with spiritual weakness. But what I experienced taught me exactly the opposite. The courage to face the depths of my own faith, with everything that came to light, made me stronger than any superficial religiosity. Not because I have all the answers, but because I stopped fearing questions, because I stopped fearing the gaze of others, because I found within myself a place where faith no longer needs to compete with pain. The two coexist, sustain each other, and in some mysterious way, heal each other. This new sense of faith I carry today didn't come wrapped in easy promises. It came from the practice of persisting even when it seemed like nothing made sense. It came from the decision to remain connected to the divine even when the surrounding terrain was hostile. And it was through this daily practice, almost like a handmade reconstruction of the soul, that I understood that true spirituality doesn't seek perfection, it seeks presence. A living, active presence that transforms, illuminates, and has the power to restore us to ourselves. That's why today, when I speak about my faith, I no longer speak in a rush to convince anyone. I speak with the serenity of someone who has experienced firsthand the impact of deconstructing and rebuilding everything. Because before, I knew the faith I was taught. Now, I know the faith I lived. And this difference changes everything. Because it not only sustained me through the pain, it pushed me toward a kind of freedom I had never experienced. And it was precisely this freedom that led me to clearly see the next step I needed to take. Because there, between the scars and the new convictions, I began to perceive something that, until then, I couldn't name. If this conversation resonated with you, if it somehow brought you relief, clarity, or even that feeling of, whoo, it's not just me, then perhaps it's time to continue walking together. Here we dig deep, without masks, without ready-made formulas, only with truths that touch the soul and transform our perspective. So, if this type of content resonates with you, subscribe to the channel. It will be great to have you around for future conversations. And if you got this far, tell me in the comments by writing. I'm with you until the end. I read everything, and it really helps me know we're in this exchange, that I'm not just talking to myself. Oh, and if this video touched you in any way, leave a like. Not only because it helps the channel, but because it reinforces the connection we've built during this time together.